Mrs. Henderson, her face a thundercloud of fury, pointed a trembling finger at my gleaming Rolls-Royce Phantom, its midnight blue paint shimmering under the afternoon sun. That monstrosity. It violates every single aesthetic guideline in this community, she shrieked, her voice echoing across the manicured lawns. Moments later, the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser painted streaks across the perfectly white picket fences, followed by another, and then another. My heart hammered against my ribs. What had I done? This was supposed to be my quiet haven, a place of peace, not a scene out of a crime drama. The officers emerged from their vehicles, their expressions grim, and headed straight for my driveway. Life had not always been so polished. My name is Alex, and just a few years ago, the idea of owning a Rolls-Royce, or even living in a house with an HOA, would have been a fantastical dream. My childhood was spent in a small, cramped apartment in a bustling city, the kind of place where sirens were a nightly lullaby and privacy was a luxury we couldn't afford. My mom, Sarah, worked tirelessly, sometimes 2 jobs, just to keep food on the table and a roof over our heads. She was a beacon of resilience, teaching me the value of hard work, kindness, and empathy, even when life offered little in return. Alex, she would often say, her hands calloused from years of labor, always remember to treat others with the same respect you wish for yourself. A little kindness goes a long way, and empathy can bridge any divide. Those words became my guiding stars, etched into my very being. I remember one particularly harsh winter when an elderly neighbor, Mr. Harrison, fell ill. He lived alone, and his heating had broken down. My mom, despite our own meager resources, didn't hesitate. She cooked him warm meals, brought him extra blankets, and even spent her precious few hours of free time just sitting with him, listening to his stories. I helped too, running errands and making sure he had everything he needed. It wasn't about expecting anything in return, it was simply about caring for another human being. Mr. Harrison eventually recovered, and though he never had much to give back financially, the grateful sparkle in his eyes and his heartfelt "thank you" were worth more than any money. That experience solidified my understanding of what truly mattered in life. It wasn't about accumulating wealth, but about accumulating moments of connection and making a positive difference, however small. As I grew older, I carried those lessons with me. I worked hard in school, driven by a desire to ease my mom's burdens and to create a life where we didn't have to worry about the next meal. After graduation, I took on every odd job I could find, saving every penny. My big break came unexpectedly. I had developed a passion for coding, spending countless late nights teaching myself intricate programming languages. I saw a problem in the local community: small businesses struggled to get online, lacking the resources for professional websites. I started offering my services for free to a few local shops, just to build my portfolio and gain experience. One of those shop owners, impressed by my work ethic and the quality of my designs, introduced me to a friend who ran a tech startup. That introduction changed everything. The startup was small, just a handful of dedicated individuals with a revolutionary idea. They were building an innovative software solution, something truly groundbreaking, but they were short on skilled developers. I joined them, pouring my heart and soul into the project. There were long hours, countless setbacks, and moments of doubt, but the shared vision kept us going. We believed in what we were creating, a tool that would genuinely help people streamline their lives. And then, it happened. Our software took off, not just in our city, but across the country, then globally. The company grew exponentially, and with that growth came success beyond anything I could have ever imagined. Suddenly, I found myself with resources I'd only ever dreamed of. The first thing I did was buy my mom the house she always wanted, a charming little place with a garden where she could grow her beloved roses. Then, I decided it was time for me to find my own quiet space, a place where I could recharge and reflect. I chose this community, Willow Creek Estates, for its serene beauty and seemingly peaceful atmosphere. It was advertised as a place where families thrived and neighbors looked out for one another. The houses were beautiful, each with its own character, yet adhering to a certain harmonious aesthetic. I pored over the HOA guidelines, wanting to be a good resident. They were extensive, covering everything from paint colors to mailbox designs, but I was confident I could abide by them. My new house was lovely, a modern craftsman with a sprawling front porch. I spent weeks settling in, enjoying the quiet mornings and the friendly waves from passers-by. Mrs. Henderson, however, was an anomaly. She lived directly across the street and seemed to embody every stereotype of an overzealous HOA board member. Her perfectly coiffed hair and perpetually pursed lips were a constant fixture in my peripheral vision. She had a keen eye for perceived infractions, often citing obscure rules to anyone who dared to deviate even slightly from her interpretation of perfection. A rogue leaf on a sidewalk, a slightly overgrown rose bush, nothing escaped her watchful gaze. I had heard whispers from other neighbors about her constant complaints and how she often blew minor issues out of proportion. I initially dismissed them, thinking perhaps she just took her role seriously. One sunny afternoon, I was watering my newly planted petunias when Mrs. Henderson approached my property line, her hands on her hips. "Mr. Davies," she began, her voice stiff, "I must insist you trim that hedge. It's exceeding the approved height by at least 2 inches. It's clearly stated in Section 4.3b of the Community Guidelines." I looked at the hedge, barely noticeable, and then at her. "Of course, Mrs. Henderson," I replied, trying to be polite, "I'll get to it this weekend." She nodded curtly and walked away, leaving me feeling a mixture of annoyance and amusement. It was a minor incident, easily resolved, but it was a preview of things to come. My Rolls-Royce Phantom arrived a few days later. I had purchased it as a tribute to my journey, a symbol of how far I had come from those humble beginnings. It was a masterpiece of engineering and design, and I parked it proudly in my driveway, eager to admire its lines. The moment the transport truck pulled away, I saw Mrs. Henderson's curtains twitch. Her reaction was immediate and visceral. She stormed out of her house, her face contorted in an expression of pure outrage. "What in the world is that?" she bellowed, her voice carrying across the quiet street. "You cannot park that beast in this neighborhood. It's a blight. It completely disrupts the aesthetic harmony." She began pacing back and forth on her lawn, gesticulating wildly towards my car as if it were an alien invasion. Other neighbors, drawn by the commotion, started to emerge from their houses, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern. Mrs. Henderson's tirade escalated, her voice growing shriller with each word. "This is Willow Creek Estates, not some common street. This is an outrage. I'm calling the HOA. I'm calling everyone." She pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the keypad, her eyes still fixed on my car with an unholy glare. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with Mrs. Henderson's fury and the uneasy silence of the onlookers. It was clear this was no ordinary neighborly dispute. Then, the distinct wail of sirens pierced the afternoon stillness, growing louder and louder, until the first police cruiser rounded the corner, followed closely by 2 more. My breath hitched in my throat. This was far beyond a simple HOA violation. The wail of the sirens intensified, cutting through the stunned silence that had fallen over Willow Creek Estates. Mrs. Henderson's triumphant smirk was undeniable as the police cars pulled to a halt, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow on the otherwise picturesque street. 2 officers stepped out of the first car, their uniforms crisp, their faces unreadable. One, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard, was Officer Miller. The other, a woman with keen, observant eyes, was Officer Davis. They approached my driveway, their gazes sweeping from Mrs. Henderson to my Rolls-Royce, and then to me. A knot tightened in my stomach. What exactly had she told them? "Mr. Davies?" Officer Miller asked, his voice calm but firm. "Yes, that's me," I responded, trying to keep my voice steady despite the rapid pounding of my heart. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her voice dripping with self-importance. "Officers, thank you for responding so quickly. This man, Mr. Davies, has committed a flagrant violation of our community's aesthetic guidelines. Look at that vehicle. It's a disgrace. It lowers property values and goes against the very fabric of our serene neighborhood." Officer Davis raised an eyebrow, her gaze flickering to the Rolls-Royce. "Ma'am, we understand you have a concern regarding a vehicle. However, our primary role here is to address potential criminal activity or breaches of public peace." Mrs. Henderson's face turned a shade of crimson. "But it is a breach of peace. It's an eyesore. It's disrupting everything." She seemed to be searching for more dramatic words, her arms still flailing towards my car. Officer Miller turned his attention back to me. "Mr. Davies, can you explain what's going on?" I took a deep breath, trying to articulate the situation clearly. "Officers, this is my car. I just moved into this community a few weeks ago. Mrs. Henderson here seems to believe it violates the HOA's aesthetic guidelines. I'm not aware of any rule that prohibits a specific make or model of vehicle, especially one legally parked on my own property." Officer Davis pulled out a small notepad. "Do you have a copy of your HOA rules, ma'am?" she asked Mrs. Henderson. "Of course, I have them memorized," Mrs. Henderson retorted, puffing out her chest. Section 6. 2D, Article B, all vehicles must be in keeping with the established aesthetic and architectural harmony of Willow Creek Estates. No garish, oversized, or commercially branded vehicles are permitted to be permanently parked on private driveways. She recited it with a flourish, as if delivering a powerful legal argument. Officer Miller exchanged a glance with Officer Davis. "Ma'am, while that rule exists within your HOA guidelines, it's highly subjective. A vehicle's aesthetic harmony is a matter of personal opinion, and it doesn't constitute a criminal offense." Mrs. Henderson gasped, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. But it's a Rolls-Royce. It screams extravagance. It's not in harmony with anything here." Officer Davis sighed almost imperceptibly. "Ma'am, owning a luxury vehicle is not illegal. As long as it's legally registered, insured, and parked on private property, there's no criminal complaint here. This is an HOA matter, and you should address it through your association's internal dispute resolution process." The color drained from Mrs. Henderson's face, replaced by a pallor of disbelief. She looked from one officer to the other, then at me, then back at her prized rulebook. The air crackled with her deflating fury. She had expected immediate action, perhaps even my car being towed away, and the police's calm, logical response was clearly not what she had anticipated. Just as the officers seemed ready to conclude their intervention, another neighbor, a kind-faced woman named Sarah Jenkins, stepped forward. She had lived in Willow Creek Estates for years and was known for her quiet demeanor. "Excuse me, officers," she said softly. "I just wanted to say that Mr. Davies has been nothing but kind since he moved in. He helped my son retrieve his kite from a tree the other day, and he even brought over some delicious homemade cookies to welcome us. His car, while certainly noticeable, isn't causing any harm." Her words, simple and genuine, seemed to puncture Mrs. Henderson's remaining bluster. Mrs. Henderson glared at Sarah, as if she had committed an unspeakable betrayal. The officers nodded, acknowledging Sarah's statement. It was a small moment, but it reinforced the idea that kindness, even in the face of conflict, could shift the narrative. The officers reiterated that they couldn't get involved in an HOA dispute, advising Mrs. Henderson to take it up with the association board. With that, they gave me a polite nod and returned to their cruisers, their flashing lights soon disappearing around the bend. The immediate crisis had passed, leaving an awkward silence in its wake. Mrs. Henderson, defeated but not entirely willing to retreat, shot one last venomous look at my car before turning on her heel and marching back into her house, slamming the door with unnecessary force. The other neighbors, sensing the show was over, began to disperse, some offering me sympathetic smiles, others just shaking their heads. Sarah Jenkins approached me, a warm smile on her face. "Don't worry about her, Alex," she said. "She gets like this. Most of us are glad to have you here." Her words were a balm to my frayed nerves, a small reminder that not everyone in Willow Creek Estates shared Mrs. Henderson's rigid worldview. I spent the rest of the afternoon feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. The incident had been resolved, at least for now, but it left a lingering question: what would Mrs. Henderson do next? I knew her type, a setback wouldn't deter her. She would simply regroup and find another angle. My earlier optimism about a peaceful, quiet life in this community felt a little shaky. My Rolls-Royce, which had been a source of pride, now felt like a magnet for conflict. It was a stark contrast to the values my mom had instilled in me: kindness, empathy, living harmoniously. How could I apply those principles when faced with such overt hostility? As evening fell, a new concern began to gnaw at me. I received an email notification. It was from the Willow Creek Estates HOA. The subject line was stark: urgent complaint regarding vehicle on 14 Maple Drive, hearing scheduled. My heart sank. Mrs. Henderson had wasted no time. The email detailed a formal complaint, citing the very rule she had quoted to the police. A hearing was scheduled for the following week, and I was expected to attend, with the explicit warning that failure to comply could result in fines and further action. It was clear that Mrs. Henderson intended to use every tool at her disposal to force me to remove my car, or worse, to make my life in Willow Creek Estates unbearable. The police might not have seen a crime, but the HOA definitely saw a problem, at least through Mrs. Henderson's determined eyes. This was just the beginning. I knew I had to prepare, to understand the HOA rules even better than she did, and to figure out how to navigate this absurd situation without compromising my values or giving in to her unreasonable demands. The peaceful haven I had envisioned was quickly turning into a battleground, and the real fight was just about to begin. The HOA hearing loomed over me like a dark cloud, turning my once peaceful new home into a place of anxiety. I spent the days leading up to it poring over the Willow Creek Estates governing documents, a thick binder filled with rules, regulations, and bylaws. My initial scan had been casual, but now I scrutinized every clause, every footnote, searching for any leverage, any loophole, anything that could support my case against Mrs. Henderson's relentless campaign. My living room transformed into a makeshift legal office, strewn with highlighted pages and scribbled notes. The rule she cited, Section 6.2d, Article B, about vehicles needing to be, in keeping with the established aesthetic and architectural harmony, seemed frustratingly vague. It was subjective, open to interpretation, and clearly designed to prevent things like dilapidated cars or commercial trucks, not a brand new luxury vehicle. I even called a friend of a friend, an attorney specializing in property law, for a quick consultation. He confirmed my suspicion: HOA rules, while legally binding, must be applied reasonably and consistently. Their rules can't be arbitrary or discriminatory, he advised. If they don't have a specific rule about a particular make or model, or a vehicle's value, then a subjective claim like, "it's not in harmony," can be challenged. You need to show them that your car doesn't actually violate any specific, objective rule, and that her complaint is based purely on personal dislike. His advice gave me a glimmer of hope, but the sheer effort of preparing for this absurd battle felt draining. It was a stark reminder that even in a place designed for peace, conflict could arise from the most unexpected corners. The day of the hearing arrived, heralded by a morning drizzle that seemed to mirror my mood. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a grand building with high ceilings and polished wooden floors. As I walked in, my heart gave a little lurch. The HOA board members sat at a long table at the front of the room, their expressions ranging from stern to mildly uncomfortable. And there, already seated in the front row, was Mrs. Henderson, her posture rigid, a triumphant glint in her eyes. She had brought a small entourage of equally stern-looking neighbors, all nodding in agreement with her every whisper. The air was thick with anticipation, and a few other residents, drawn by curiosity or concern, filled the back rows. I took a seat in the designated area for residents addressing the board. The chairperson, Mr. Davies, no relation, thankfully, a kindly-looking man with silver hair, cleared his throat. "Welcome, everyone. We are here today to address a complaint filed by Mrs. Eleanor Henderson concerning a vehicle parked at 14 Maple Drive." He gestured to me with a slight nod. "Mr. Alex Davies, the resident of 14 Maple Drive, is also present." Mrs. Henderson immediately jumped to her feet. "Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. As you know, I have resided in Willow Creek Estates for 20 years, and I have always upheld the integrity and aesthetic standards of our beautiful community. This vehicle," she paused dramatically, gesturing vaguely in my direction, "is an affront to everything we stand for. It is ostentatious, garish, and completely out of character with the classic elegance of our neighborhood. It attracts undue attention and clearly violates Section 6.2d, Article B, which states that vehicles must be in keeping with our established harmony." She launched into a passionate, albeit repetitive, monologue, reiterating her points from the street, adding vivid descriptions of how the car's very presence somehow ruined the view from her window and devalued the entire community. She had prepared a dossier of printed photos of my car, magnified to appear even more imposing, and presented them to the board with a flourish. When it was my turn to speak, I tried to remain calm and collected, channeling the resilience my mom had taught me. "Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, and members of the board. I understand Mrs. Henderson's concerns, though I respectfully disagree with her interpretation. I moved into Willow Creek Estates seeking a peaceful home, and I have made every effort to adhere to the community's rules. Regarding my car, a Rolls-Royce Phantom, it is legally registered, insured, and parked on my private property. I have reviewed the HOA guidelines thoroughly, and I cannot find any specific clause that prohibits a vehicle of its make, model, or value. The rule Mrs. Henderson cites refers to aesthetic and architectural harmony. This is a subjective term. My vehicle is a professionally manufactured, high-quality automobile, maintained in pristine condition. It is not dilapidated, not a commercial vehicle, and it doesn't create any noise or environmental disturbance. Its color is a dark, neutral blue, blending seamlessly with the natural tones often found in luxury cars and, dare I say, with many of the darker roofs and shutters in our community. I continued, trying to appeal to their logic rather than emotion. If the board were to deem this vehicle out of harmony, where would the line be drawn? Would a particularly bright red sports car be considered garish? What about an antique vehicle that might not fit a modern aesthetic? The rule needs to be applied consistently and objectively, otherwise it risks being arbitrary and unfair. My car does not violate any objective criteria for size, color, or type of vehicle that would warrant such a complaint. This feels more like a personal grievance than a legitimate HOA concern. I presented my own organized binder, filled with printouts of the relevant HOA sections, highlighted passages, and even some photos of other luxury cars parked in similar upscale communities without issue. The board members listened intently, some nodding, others scribbling notes. Mrs. Henderson, however, was growing increasingly agitated, muttering under her breath and occasionally letting out an indignant huff. The chairperson called for a brief recess to allow the board to deliberate. During the break, a few curious residents approached me, offering words of encouragement. Sarah Jenkins, who had spoken up for me at the initial confrontation, offered a small, reassuring smile. It felt good to know not everyone was against me. When the board reconvened, Mr. Davies cleared his throat once more. "We have heard both sides of the argument. The board acknowledges Mrs. Henderson's passion for maintaining community standards. However, he paused, looking directly at Mrs. Henderson. We also concur with Mr. Davies's point regarding the subjective nature of the aesthetic harmony clause. While the vehicle is indeed a luxury model, it does not, at this time, violate any specific or objective rule within our current bylaws regarding vehicle type, size, or condition. It is not commercial, not an eyesore due to disrepair, and it is legally parked on private property. A wave of relief washed over me. Mrs. Henderson, however, let out a frustrated cry. But it is an eyesore. It's too grand. It's not meant for a modest community like ours. Mr. Davies held up a hand. Mrs. Henderson, we understand your feelings. However, the board cannot make a ruling based solely on personal preference. We advise you to work with the Architectural Committee if you wish to propose more specific vehicle guidelines for future consideration. For now, Mr. Davies's vehicle is deemed to be in compliance. I almost let out a cheer, but managed to maintain a polite, neutral expression. Mrs. Henderson, however, did not. Her face contorted in disbelief, then rage. She pounded her fist on the table in front of her. This is an outrage. This is unacceptable. You are undermining the very foundation of this community. I will not stand for it. She stormed out of the clubhouse, her entourage scrambling to follow her, leaving behind a stunned silence. The chairperson sighed, clearly exhausted by the ordeal. The meeting concluded shortly after, with a few more sympathetic nods and quiet goodbyes from other residents. I walked out of the clubhouse into the damp afternoon, feeling a sense of victory, but also a deep weariness. The battle with Mrs. Henderson was far from over. Her outburst at the hearing proved she would not accept defeat. As I reached my driveway, another email notification pinged on my phone. This one was from an unfamiliar sender, but the subject line made my blood run cold. Warning, you don't belong here. Leave Willow Creek Estates, or face the consequences. It was anonymous, chilling, and clearly meant to intimidate. The peaceful community I had sought felt less like a sanctuary and more like a place where hidden animosities festered, ready to erupt. This was no longer just an HOA dispute, it felt personal, menacing, and utterly unnerving. The game had just changed. The anonymous email, stark and menacing, sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the damp afternoon. Warning, you don't belong here. Leave Willow Creek Estates, or face the consequences. The words echoed in my mind, a venomous whisper in the quiet of my home. This was a significant escalation, far beyond the petty squabbles of an HOA. This was a direct threat, chilling and personal. My initial thought was Mrs. Henderson, of course. Her recent outburst at the hearing, her palpable fury, made her the prime suspect. But could she truly resort to something like this? It felt darker, more calculated than her usual histrionics. I immediately considered reporting it to the police, but what would I tell them? An anonymous email about a car? It would likely be dismissed as a prank or an empty threat. The rational part of my brain tried to calm the rising panic. Perhaps it was just someone trying to scare me, knowing I was already at odds with Mrs. Henderson. Still, the underlying message was clear: someone in this seemingly peaceful community wanted me gone, and they were willing to cross a line to achieve it. I decided to take some immediate precautions. I reinforced the locks on my doors and windows, installed a new security camera system that covered every angle of my property, and made sure to keep my garage door closed at all times, parking the Rolls-Royce inside rather than leaving it exposed on the driveway. It felt paranoid, but the email had ignited a primal sense of unease. The serenity I had sought in Willow Creek Estates was slowly eroding, replaced by a constant low hum of vigilance. Days turned into a week, and aside from a few lingering glares from Mrs. Henderson when she spotted me, nothing overtly threatening happened. The anonymous email remained a chilling memory, a phantom threat. I began to relax slightly, convincing myself it was just a misguided attempt to scare me off. Perhaps it had even been sent by one of Mrs. Henderson's more zealous allies, someone trying to impress her. Then came the incident with the sprinklers. One morning, I woke up to a faint hissing sound coming from my front yard. I stepped outside to find my meticulously maintained lawn completely soaked, far beyond what any dew or recent rain could explain. The sprinklers were running full blast, even though the automated system was set for late evening. I checked the control panel in my garage. It was fine. Then I noticed it. The main water valve, located near the curb and usually covered by a plastic cap, was wide open, letting water gush freely onto my lawn and into the street. Someone had deliberately tampered with it in the middle of the night. It wasn't a major act of vandalism, but it was undoubtedly a nuisance, and it pointed to a clear attempt to harass me. It also highlighted a disturbing vulnerability: someone had been on my property. I immediately thought of the anonymous email again. This was too specific, too targeted to be a random act. It was a subtle, yet effective, way to cause trouble, possibly hoping for a hefty water bill or a complaint from the HOA about excessive water use. I reported the incident to the HOA management office, though I knew they would likely see it as a minor issue. They advised me to secure the valve cover with a lock, which I promptly did. The incident, small as it was, served as a stark reminder that the threats were not just empty words. Someone was actively, albeit covertly, trying to make my life difficult. My interactions with other neighbors became a peculiar dance. Most were friendly, offering genuine smiles and pleasant greetings. Sarah Jenkins continued to be a wonderful source of support, occasionally dropping off baked goods or stopping for a chat. She even discreetly mentioned that Mrs. Henderson was still grumbling about the Rolls-Royce, but that the general consensus among other residents was that Mrs. Henderson was overreacting. However, there was a noticeable tension whenever Mrs. Henderson herself was in sight. People would either visibly stiffen or quickly avert their gaze, clearly not wanting to be associated with her drama. It made me wonder how many other residents had faced her ire over minor infractions. I tried my best to maintain the kind and empathetic approach my mother had taught me. I continued to help neighbors where I could, offering a hand with groceries, retrieving a runaway pet, or simply offering a friendly wave. I believed that by being a good neighbor, I could counteract the negativity Mrs. Henderson was trying to sow. Perhaps if enough people saw me as a positive addition to the community, her complaints would lose their power. It was a slow process, however, and the undercurrent of hostility persisted. One particularly frustrating afternoon, I found a flyer taped to my mailbox. It wasn't an official HOA notice. Instead, it was a crudely printed image of a garish, oversized monster truck, with a thought bubble above it saying, "Coming soon to Willow Creek Estates?" Below the image, in bold, jagged letters, it read, "Thanks, Alex Davies, for lowering our standards." It was another clear, albeit childish, attempt to antagonize me, directly linking me to the perceived decline of the neighborhood. This time, the attack was public, visible to anyone walking by. It felt like a deliberate attempt to turn other residents against me, to make me an outcast. My patience, usually abundant, was starting to wear thin. These were not the actions of a reasonable person simply upholding community standards. This was harassment. The constant low-level attacks were designed to chip away at my peace of mind, to make me feel unwelcome. I carefully peeled the flyer off my mailbox, the adhesive leaving a sticky residue. As I crumpled it in my hand, I glanced across the street. Mrs. Henderson was standing by her window, her curtain slightly parted, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on her lips. It was too subtle to be definitive proof, but the timing, coupled with her known animosity, made her the most likely culprit for these escalating acts. This wasn't just about a car anymore. This was about a personal vendetta, and it was about to get much more intense. The appearance of the taunting flyer on my mailbox felt like a gauntlet thrown down, a deliberate escalation from the anonymous email and the tampered sprinklers. It was no longer subtle, this was a public display of hostility, aimed at embarrassing me and turning the community against me. The sight of Mrs. Henderson's faint smirk in her window confirmed my suspicions. This wasn't some random prankster, it was personal, and she was clearly enjoying my discomfort. My resolve, which had been stretched thin by her constant antagonism, began to harden. I realized I couldn't simply endure this. I had to find a way to address it, not just for my own peace of mind, but to ensure that this behavior didn't poison the entire community. I started documenting everything. Every odd incident, every suspicious happening, every subtle hint of surveillance from Mrs. Henderson's house. I created a digital log, complete with dates, times, and descriptions. I even added a small, discreet camera on my front porch that had a wider view, hoping to catch any future shenanigans on video. It felt like I was preparing for a legal case, not living in a quiet suburban neighborhood. This constant state of alert was exhausting, a stark contrast to the calm, reflective life I had envisioned when I bought the house. Despite the mounting tension, I made a conscious effort to continue being the kind and helpful neighbor my mother had raised me to be. I volunteered to help Sarah Jenkins with a charity bake sale, offering to set up tables and carry boxes. I even joined a community cleanup day, picking up litter along the walking trails, much to the surprise of some residents who probably expected me to be aloof or standoffish given the ongoing drama. I wanted to prove, through my actions, that I was a contributing, positive member of the community, regardless of Mrs. Henderson's relentless campaign. It was an uphill battle, but I believed that genuine kindness would ultimately shine brighter than petty malice. My interactions with Mrs. Henderson, however, grew increasingly strained. She would often walk her small, yappy dog past my house, deliberately slowing down, her eyes narrowed at my garage door, where the Rolls-Royce was now safely tucked away. Sometimes, I'd hear her loudly complaining to other neighbors about the new element in the community, clearly referring to me and my car, though never directly by name. It was a constant, low-level harassment that chipped away at my patience. Then came the incident with the package. I had ordered a fairly expensive piece of computer equipment, crucial for my work. The tracking showed it had been delivered and left at my front door. However, when I arrived home, the package was nowhere to be found. I checked with the delivery company, my neighbors, and even reviewed my security camera footage. The footage showed the delivery driver leaving the package exactly where they said they would. A few minutes later, the footage showed someone walking up my driveway, a figure obscured by a wide-brimmed hat and large sunglasses, bending down, and calmly walking away with my package. The figure then entered Mrs. Henderson's house. My heart pounded. It wasn't definitive proof, the quality wasn't crystal clear enough to identify the person's face, but the clothing, the stature, and the fact they entered her house immediately afterward was damning circumstantial evidence. This was no longer a minor annoyance, this was theft. It was a clear, criminal act, and it crossed a line I couldn't ignore. My resolve to maintain peace shattered. This person was directly impacting my livelihood and committing an outright crime on my property. My mind raced. Should I confront her? Call the police again? I had to be strategic. A direct confrontation without irrefutable proof would just lead to more drama and denials. And the police, without a clearer picture, might still hesitate to act on an accusation based on grainy footage and a history of neighborly disputes. I decided to take a different approach. I knew Mrs. Henderson prided herself on her reputation, however flawed it might be in reality. I decided to make her uncomfortable, to show her that I was aware of her actions without directly accusing her in public. The next morning, I purchased a small, high-quality, motion-activated camera and discreetly placed it in a bush near my mailbox, perfectly angled to capture anyone approaching my front door from the street, providing a clearer, head-on view. I also contacted the delivery company to report the package missing, explaining the situation and mentioning my security footage, though I held back the full details for now. They opened an investigation, which was standard procedure. The following day, a pristine, new, identical package magically appeared on my doorstep. It was too coincidental. No delivery truck, no notification, it just appeared. Someone had returned it, clearly having taken it and then thought better of it. The message was clear: they knew I knew. It was a small victory, a silent acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but it also confirmed the malicious intent behind these escalating incidents. The level of audacity, coupled with the immediate return, indicated a desperate attempt to avoid further trouble. The constant feeling of being targeted, however, lingered. My next step, I decided, would be to share my growing dossier of incidents with select, trusted neighbors, particularly Sarah Jenkins. I needed to show them the full extent of Mrs. Henderson's behavior, not just her public outbursts, but the covert harassment and now, the outright theft. I believed that by uniting with other residents, we could collectively address this escalating pattern of malice. The community, after all, was supposed to be a place of harmony, and Mrs. Henderson was actively disrupting that peace for everyone, not just me. This was no longer just about a car or an HOA rule. It was about protecting the very fabric of Willow Creek Estates from a campaign of intimidation. I knew that the next move, whatever it might be, would have to be decisive. The pressure was building, and a confrontation, more significant than any before, felt inevitable. The return of the stolen package, a silent admission of guilt, solidified my resolve. It was clear Mrs. Henderson knew I was onto her. The hidden camera in the bush was now actively recording, waiting. I knew I couldn't let this go on. It was time to expose her tactics, not just for my own sake, but for the peace of the entire community. This escalating harassment, culminating in theft, needed to be brought into the light. I decided to start by speaking with Sarah Jenkins, the kind neighbor who had already shown me support. I invited her over for coffee, and as we sat in my living room, I explained everything, from the anonymous email to the tampered sprinklers, and finally, the vanishing and reappearance of my package. I showed her the security footage, carefully pausing at the obscured figure entering Mrs. Henderson's house with my box. Sarah's eyes widened with each new revelation. "Alex, this is beyond what I imagined," she whispered, her face etched with concern. I knew she was difficult, but this is truly shocking. You can't let this continue. Encouraged by her reaction, I decided to take the bold step of calling for a special HOA meeting. I drafted a formal request, citing a pattern of harassment and rule violations by a resident, and attached my detailed log of incidents, omitting specific names for the initial request, but clearly indicating the nature of the complaints. The request, once submitted, stirred a quiet buzz among the residents. Many were tired of Mrs. Henderson's constant nitpicking and domineering attitude, and they sensed this meeting was about something far more serious than a hedge being 2 inches too tall. The special HOA meeting was scheduled for a Friday evening, and the clubhouse was packed. More residents than usual attended, their faces a mix of apprehension and curiosity. Mrs. Henderson was there, of course, seated prominently in the front row, radiating an air of self-importance. She shot me a smug, almost challenging look when I walked in, unaware of the full extent of what was coming. Mr. Davies, the HOA chairperson, began the meeting, his usual calm demeanor strained. "Good evening, everyone. We've convened this special meeting to address a serious matter that has been brought to the board's attention by Mr. Alex Davies regarding ongoing issues in our community." He then gestured for me to speak. I stood up, taking a deep breath. "Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, board members, and fellow residents," I began, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "As many of you know, there have been some misunderstandings since I moved to Willow Creek Estates, particularly concerning my vehicle. While the HOA board previously ruled on that matter, the situation has unfortunately escalated beyond a simple disagreement about aesthetics." I then systematically laid out my evidence, not with anger, but with a calm, factual delivery. Initially, I received an anonymous email threatening me to leave the community. I displayed a printout of the email on a projector screen. Then, my sprinklers were tampered with, causing excessive water waste. I showed photos of the gushing water and the unlocked valve. A murmur rippled through the room. Most recently, crude and harassing flyers targeting me were placed on my mailbox, designed to turn neighbors against me. I displayed a photo of the monster truck flyer. Mrs. Henderson, visibly agitated, started to interject. "This is preposterous. He's fabricating stories. It's all a ploy to distract from his ostentatious vehicle." Mr. Davies held up a hand, silencing her. "Mrs. Henderson, please allow Mr. Davies to finish his statement." I continued, my gaze steady on Mrs. Henderson. "And finally, I experienced the theft of a valuable package from my doorstep. Thankfully, it was returned, but the act itself was a clear violation of law and community trust." I paused, allowing the gravity of the statement to sink in. "I believe I know who is responsible for these actions, and I have evidence to support my claim." A gasp went through the room. All eyes turned to Mrs. Henderson, who had gone pale, her smugness evaporating into a mask of fear. "I have footage from my security cameras," I stated, pulling out a USB drive. "Footage that clearly shows the individual who took my package and then entered Mrs. Henderson's residence immediately afterwards." I inserted the USB drive, and the clubhouse screen flickered to life, showing the clear, high-definition footage from my newly installed camera. The video played. First, the delivery person placing the package. Then, a few minutes later, the figure in the hat and sunglasses, walking deliberately up my driveway. The camera's clear angle captured the individual bending down, picking up the package, and then turning, walking directly across the street, and entering Mrs. Henderson's front door. The clarity was undeniable. The clothing, the gait, though the face was partially obscured, it was overwhelmingly clear who it was. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the hum of the projector. Mrs. Henderson let out a strangled cry, her face contorting in a mixture of shock and fury. That's doctored. He's lying. It's a conspiracy," she shrieked, scrambling to her feet, her voice cracking. But it was too late. The collective gasp from the residents, the horrified expressions on the board members' faces, spoke volumes. Sarah Jenkins, sitting nearby, looked utterly devastated, her hand covering her mouth. Mrs. Henderson's carefully constructed facade of community guardian had crumbled, revealing the vindictive nature beneath. Just then, as Mrs. Henderson continued to protest wildly, a sudden commotion erupted near the entrance. Two police officers, Officer Miller and Officer Davis from the previous encounter, walked into the clubhouse, their presence immediately commanding attention. They scanned the room, their eyes landing on me, then on the projection screen, which was still displaying the damning video footage. Officer Miller stepped forward. "Excuse me, Mr. Davies," he said, his voice cutting through the remaining tension. "We received an anonymous tip, along with a link to some rather disturbing video evidence, suggesting a pattern of harassment and a recent theft in this community. We understand a meeting is underway regarding these very matters." His gaze swept over Mrs. Henderson, who had now slumped back into her chair, looking utterly defeated. "Indeed, officer," Mr. Davies, the chairperson, replied, clearly relieved by the police presence. Mr. Davies was just presenting his evidence. Officer Davis approached the screen, watching the last few seconds of the video, her expression hardening. "Mrs. Henderson, we need to speak with you outside," she stated, her voice leaving no room for argument. Mrs. Henderson, her face ashen, rose slowly. She looked at me, then at the stunned faces of her neighbors, and finally at the unwavering gaze of the police officers. The air was thick with the weight of her exposed deceit. Without another word, she was escorted out of the clubhouse by the officers. The room erupted in murmurs, a mixture of disbelief, relief, and quiet satisfaction. The wild ending I never saw coming was here. The Karen, who had tormented me, whose obsession with my Rolls-Royce had spiraled into criminal behavior, was finally facing the consequences. My peaceful haven had found its peace at last, but the journey to get there had been anything but quiet.